Hi everyone, welcome to episode number 31 of the Bill Podcast, and today we'll be going through InuitCSS. So InuitCSS is a scalable and SaaS-based BEM object-oriented CSS framework. The reason why I decided to delve into this framework this episode is because it just has so many good founding principles that we can use in our daily CSS and style sheet coding. So let's firstly look at their website. This is a very simple website with the blogging that gives us tips and tricks and updates on the framework itself. And then we of course have the Twitter. So do go ahead and follow Twitter because this is replied directly by Harry Roberts, who is also the founder of CSS Visitor II, an amazing blog, and he created InuitCSS. So do go ahead and follow Twitter if you want to report some bugs or even ask for some tips. And finally, this is the GitHub repository of Inuit. This is where we will come ahead and download the repository and use it in our project. Now, before we go ahead and look at the project itself, let us first explore some of the founding principles of Inuit, which are SAS, which is a CSS preprocessor, BEM, which is block element and modifier, and OOCSS, which means object-oriented CSS. Let's first look at SAS. This is a CSS preprocessor, which is of course highly recommended. Either you can use SAS or Stylus or less. Well, I prefer SAS, but you can go ahead and try out all of them and choose for yourself. So SAS is what Inuit is using, and it comes with a lot of features. For example, variables, nesting, mixing, selector inheritance. I did an episode on SAS previously, so you can go and look at it. Or otherwise, there are tons of other tutorials on the internet itself. So SAS is amazing. The next thing that I kind of discovered through Inuit is this BEM modeling of naming terms and features in our code. So what is BEM? BEM stands for block, element, and modifier. And this page inside bem.info, well, I'm actually inside /method/definitions, which kind of explains how do we use it in our code. It's very well illustrated. So block basically refers to the big chunk or sections in our page. For example, over here it kind of mentions this is the header, and then we have the main, and then we have the footer. And if we kind of go a little bit at the bottom, it will also explain what are elements. So elements are, for example, the components inside the block. As it says here, is part of a block that performs certain function. And lastly, it is a sort of a modifier. So what is exactly a modifier? For example, here we notice that if we go to a particular tab, it becomes the current item. So that element itself, how does it change? Maybe you're hovering over it or you're making it active. So BEM is something I recently discovered, but it is really amazing how you can make it more readable for our code developers to understand what we are doing, or even for ourselves if we come back to our code 6 months from now. So I highly recommend you to go and check out bem.info that Inuit uses. Lastly is this term called object-oriented CSS, which is popularized by Nicole Sullivan or Stubbornella. You can go ahead and look at the examples that she puts in this website, oocss.org. The other one that I recently discovered is this amazing book by Jonathan Snook, which is called SMACS, or rather Scalable Modular Architecture for CSS. Please do go ahead, buy the book, and while waiting for the purchase, we can also go through these little instructions that come along with it. For example, if we go to the chapter called Depth of Applicability, we will see that here, for example, we tend to repeat whatever we want to say in our CSS, but he kind of explains that, hey, we shouldn't be doing that. Instead, just replace it with a class, and then it will make it a lot more modular, maintainable, and scalable in the future. So these are some of the awesome resources that comes with Inuit. So I like Inuit in the sense that it sort of became a reference model for me to pick up of good practices, which is number 1, a CSS preprocessor, number 2, a style of naming, and number 3, object-oriented framework. So let's finally go ahead and look at our project for today. Our project for today is really simple, and we'll be building this internet reference model, which is a computer networking model that is used in our modern network system. So it starts at the top layer with application, and then it transits down to transport layer, internet layer, and link layer. It's really amazing to kind of go through the network abstraction layers of modern computing and understand a little bit about this. So it's a very simple project once again, but it will allow us to understand how do we use InuitCSS, and more importantly, the founding frameworks that guides Inuit. Finally, I would like to attribute this idea of building this little internet reference model from the current course that I'm taking in computer networks, and really thank Prof. David Witherall. And I am referring to the lecture notes number 16 and slide number 12 that I came up with this little diagram that he shows. It really forms a sort of foundation of computer networks. So this is what I kind of drew inspiration from to do our project for this week. So let's go ahead and start our project. Obviously, I'm inside an empty folder in my project. So let's just open this up in Sublime Text. The very first thing we will do, notice here it's obviously empty, is to create an index.html page. So it will be really simple. And let's just call it Internet Reference Model. And after this, I'll just link it to the style sheet. It will be inside the folder CSS and style.min.css, or whatever you would like to refer it to. Okay, so now that the index.html is ready, let's go ahead and incorporate InuitCSS into our project. So the very first thing that we will do is clone the repository of Inuit. So I'm here in my GitHub, and I will copy the Git repository address, and here I will do git clone and then the repository and then the folder name, which in this case will be CSS. Okay, so now if we go back to Sublime, imagine that we have the CSS folder right now. So obviously I will not need some of the files here, for example license, readme, and so on. So let me just go ahead and delete it. So I'll just go inside CSS and RM. So looks like now we only have the development files. So let's go ahead and look at the very first file, which is style.scss. And over here, very clearly, there are lots of documentation comments that we can refer to. And here, there are only just 2 files that we should refer. The one is the vars, which is right over here, which consists of all the variables that is required for the project. We can go ahead and look at it. And then the next one is inuit.css, then Inuit. So if we go inside here, this is the file that it's referring to. And inside this file, it's once again importing other partials, and there are seriously tons of them to kind of extend and import. Let's firstly go ahead and look at the variables file, which consists of all the variables in the project. Good thing is that the very first one is debug mode. Maybe in our development we can turn it to true so that we can see what happens. I also like to have the global border box as true, which means that box sizing, border box will be enabled, and this just means that whatever width you put, everything, padding, margin, and border will be inside the width. So it will not follow the typical CSS box model, but everything will be inside the width. So you can see it is also defined as the base font and the line height, responsiveness, a little bit of typography here. Finally is the brand color and the brand font family. So after looking at the various file structures, which is var and then the Inuit file inside, let's go ahead and look at this very important file, which is the watch file. It basically executes the sass command here. So obviously we will do it in a style compressed version. So let's go ahead and execute the watch file. So I'm inside my command line once again, and inside the CSS folder, and over here I'll just execute the watch. When we do that, notice that for some of us there might be this encoding error. This is because we will need to sort of add this little UTF-8 charset markup into each of our files. What you need to do is just go at the top of all the files that we are using and just add that little thing. So I'll go ahead and add it and restart the watch. Alright, so I have added in this little charset UTF-8 at the start of all the files, and now I will come back to my command line and start the watch. And yes, Sass is watching and it created style.min.css. So if we come back to our text editor, yes, a new file is created. Finally, let's just open this up in the browser. Obviously, we will not see much difference, so let's just go ahead and add some content. The very first thing we will do is just the header. So why don't we go ahead and add some custom style sheets. So the author of the project actually says that we can include all our custom style sheets right here. Add an import, and he kind of uses this new UI folder with a lot of partials, but we'll just have one called page because it's a very simple project. So I'm just gonna inside a InuitCSS folder create a new folder called UI, and inside UI I'll just have page.scss, and obviously my reference below should be InuitCSS/UI. Firstly, before we start, I wanted to look at Inuit.sats file, and over here we will not be using a lot of the components because this is just such a simple project. But even if your project doesn't use this, let's say things like forms or tables, we can go ahead and easily comment it out. So I'll just go ahead and comment these out and save it. And we will just require the grids and not much of the rest of the things. So I'll also go ahead and comment it out. Finally, let's go ahead and incorporate our own styles into this page.sass. So let's first go into the variables file, and over here right at the bottom we see that we can actually define our brand stuff like the font family and color. Yes, we would like to use it. So why don't we go ahead in page.sass and create our very first elements. So here we will do a bit of body, and let's just add a padding of 20 pixel, and color in this case we will add in the brand color. Notice this is a very good practice because if we do want to change the brand color from this value over here to something else, we can easily change this value, and everywhere in our style sheet it will be reflected. So let's see whether that happens, and yes, the brand color is reflected right here. Finally, I definitely want the font family to be the Helvetica as well, so let me come back here and choose the font family. It's reflected and it is taking up Inuit.css styles. So let me now go ahead and add in the first layer, which is application layer. Now let's go ahead and add in some of the grids. So where are the grids located? As you can see in the well documented CSS, we will see that the grids are located right inside objects and then grids. So let's go ahead inside objects and go for the grids. There you go. And as Harry Roberts has said, he kind of documents it very well, so we can sort of pick up the styles right from here. So let me go ahead and sort of cut and paste it here. And now when we come back, yep, all the grids seem to be working. If we go inside, the grids are pretty cool. Just for the sake of completeness, why don't we build from the bottom up so that we kind of build all the boxes? And I will start with the link layer right at the bottom. Now, in order to define the lengths of the grid size, we have this file called widths, and we are inside this file, and here I am looking at some of the elements to use. So looks like we can start off with the one hole, which will kind of occupy the entire thing. So let me just delete all of this away, and yep, we will start with one hole first, and inside one hole we will have it as 802.11. And inside the one hole, we will have a box that is 3/4, as it says. Where is the quarter one? There you go. So we will use the 3/4 and then 1/2 and then 1/4. So over here, I'll just do .g.3/4, and inside here in a paragraph, it will be IP. Similarly, I'll just create another one, .g.1/2, and inside the paragraph, it will be TCP, and lastly, it will be .g.1/4. Inside here, the paragraph, it will be HTTP. Yep, looks quite okay, but we definitely need some color elements here. So once again, we will go back to our page.scss and we will define one whole. And this time we will give it a background color and lighten it by 40%. Yep, seems to be working. And we will follow similarly for 3/4 as well. And same thing, we will give it a brand color and lighten it by 30%. That looks okay. And I will go ahead and add in 2 more. So basically I'm just lightening it up by a lesser percentage. Our div here will need some kind of margin and padding because it's touching one another. So I'll just go ahead into the page and add in a little bit of styles just for the .g and .gw. Right, that kind of looks fine. And lastly, we will add in some slight bit of typography so that the margin is 0 and it is displayed in line block. And there you go. And finally, looks like we just need to shift it to the right, and we will go ahead and do that to this G element over here so that it is applied for all of them, and do float right. Yep, that seems to do the trick. Now all we need to do is replicate this for other layers. So let me copy this for the internet layer. But for the internet layer, the very outer layer will not exist. So why don't we include a class called invisible? So what this invisible class will do is that it will make the background totally transparent. And there you go. The background color has been transparent and it is removed. Why don't we go ahead and replicate the other layers? So we will do the transport layer, and for that we'll just copy it once again and call it transport. This time we will add the class invisible to 3/4 as well and remove the IP. Perfect. And lastly, we will do the application layer, which will be very similar. We will take the invisible and apply it to the 1/2 box as well and take away the TCP. Right, so that looks pretty cool. Now notice I only applied the invisible once in my style sheet and then just applied it across in my HTML markup. I didn't have to do it again and again. This is part of how it can become modular. Finally, looks like it would do good if I can just centralize H1. So I'll just say text align and center. And after I come back, yep, that is our completed project. And guess what? This is responsive as well. So that's it for this week's episode. A very simple one, but I hope it has given us a glimpse into good CSS authoring with Inuit, as well as CSS preprocessor, BEM, and object-oriented CSS. So do check out this project. Now a little bit about the associated links for this project. Yes, coming back to the object-oriented CSS page, as well as bem.info, as well as CSS preprocessor. Now for other reference links, do check out this article from Web Design Tips Plus by Harry Roberts himself, Rubbing Nose with InuitCSS, which he talks about how to basically set up the project as well as some of the good principles. Do check out the article inside InuitCSS.com on how to get it started, as well as a screencast by Harry Roberts on how to set up Inuit.CSS. And I also like this article from Smashing Magazine, What is BEM, as well as some functionalities and features added to Inuit version 4. And of course, lastly is the Coursera course that I'm taking, which is Introduction to Computer Networks, based on which I created this little project. And finally, for the related build podcast, do check out the episode on SAS. So let's go through finally the build link of the episode. It goes to CSS Visitor II, which is by Harry Roberts himself. He consistently writes very thoughtful and in-depth articles on front-end development and CSS. For example, latest ones are like front-end performance for web designers, or even like open sourcing something, his Git workflow, code smells in CSS. Each of them are highly recommended for us to get better in coding CSS or front-end and coding practices in general. So thank you, Harry, so much for his awesome contribution. And that's it for this week's episode, and I hope you enjoyed looking into what we can do in CSS into making it better, scalable, and modular with InuitCSS. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.